those leaders wanted to move forward with that. There was a small contingency of people that did not want to. And because the Constitution was so old, it allowed for non-active members, whether they had been on the membership roll of that congregation or not, to come back and vote. They were not worshiping there, they were not engaging in that congregation, but they were recruited to come back and to cast votes. And that vote almost did not happen for the two congregations voted to split. And then the one congregation did become part of the parish, the other did not. Quite a division. They both owned the parsonage together. With the Constitution not being a current living document, the other thing that it did is it limited those who were confirmed that can vote. Some constitutions, the newer one, will say if you are a confirmed member of the congregation, an active voting member, but old constitutions will say confirmed of legal age to vote. So that means whatever that legal age in that state is, that's who would be allowed to vote. And in that same congregation, it eliminated all of those confirmation students who were 16, 17, who wanted to be a part of the voting life of that church. So one example. Another example to share about difficult situations was a call committee, where the Constitution bylaws, the provisions and bylaws related to committees, and specifically the call committee, was so restrictive, it did not allow for any kind of diversity in that call committee, dictated very clearly in old standard. So no young people could be a part of that call committee. No youth could be a part of that call committee, trying to enact that in a 2016 situation, right? So some of those pieces that might live in our old constitutions, if we think, we don't really have to worry about it. Think about the what ifs of our life together in decision-making of changes. That's why a current constitution, a living one, is so important, because until you need it, you're going to regret sometimes if you don't have it updated, if you're in a conflict situation or a difficult situation.
Thank you very much. Those are really good illustrations and encouragement to get Constitution.
Question over here, yeah.
Yeah.
You talk about the Constitution. Our church has a Constitution that we follow, and we also have bylaws.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Does the Constitution override bylaws?
Bylaws can never be out of conformity with the Constitution. They can never be in conflict with the Constitution.
Therefore, if they are at this point, that'll be a good reason for you to do some revision.
Yeah.
The bylaws are meant to be an interpretation, kind of, here is number of the Constitution. The bylaw is supposed to be an interpretation. And not only should it not contradict it, it shouldn't contradict any part of the Constitution, not just where it sits under. It has to be a one voice.
So for instance, related to a congregational meeting, okay? An annual congregational meeting is to be held, that's a provision or amendment, they're called. The language will use provision now. A bylaw right underneath of that would be, our congregation will have its annual meeting on the fourth Sunday of January at 2:00. If you want to hone in on that kind of specific time, date and time, you can do that in a bylaw. You could also do it in the amendment if that's where you want it to land, but you could do it in a bylaw, which then could be changed more easily than the amendment.
The discussion we had is just this past year, we had to reshingle our church. The Constitution said that the council would authorize an expenditure of no more than $1,000 without congressional approval. Our bylaws say we can spend $1,500 without. To me, that was a conflict.
Yes.
I know.
Yeah.
So we would have to, that makes that bylaw that says 1,500 really null and void.
Correct.
Correct.
Because it
That is
falls back, the Constitution carries authority over that.
That's right.
Yes.
And
you-
so it should not have happened,
Right.
that they have to agree,
Yeah.
you know, so
That's
whoever.
what I kind of caught.
Yeah.
And there's two things to clarify there in your constitution work. There will be one that is usually a provision of how much you can spend up to without congregational vote or meeting.
Yeah.
The other one is how much you can spend, which is above and beyond the actual budget without a congregation. Those are two different things. So that's a very important piece to have in your constitution.
Well, I might even argue that not show up in the Constitution,
Right,
that you put it down in bylaws or
Right.
continuing resolutions,
right.
someplace that's a little more flexible. If you put it in the Constitution, you're locked until you go through the process of changing that. There's no way around that. And something like that, I think you want to have a little flexibility. Put it down in bylaws, continuing resolutions, some places that are easier to change than the Constitution is.
So there should probably be not even a monetary number in a Constitution.
Ours is not. I go to Zumbro Lutheran and it's tough
Well,
way
this-
down there.
I was just partially reading our
Yes.
Constitution.
Yeah.
From years ago.
It depends on the personality of the congregation. It really does. I mean, for some congregations, they do not see the giving the full autonomy to the council to decide fiscally, right? And so for some, there is that piece that they want to be able to have. So it does come down to a conversation in your congregation of, I mean, that's why the Constitution is a living document. It has to represent what you are about as a congregation today.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm more concerned about, back in 1980, $1,000 bought a lot.
Right, of course,
Today, you can't change a window.
right. So.
Right. And that's,
yeah.
your point is very well taken.
Yeah.
And that's why you don't want it in the Constitution.
Right.
So
Oh,
You
this is
just-
one of your projects this year, when you redo the Constitution.
that's what I'm.
Stay tuned, we're gonna tell you.
We're gonna talk about it.
Yeah. We're gonna make 2 trips through this discussion. This one slide is going to be just the broad overview of the review process of your Constitution. And then we'll spend several slides going back in detail, so you'll have 2 chances of looking at it. We offer you the possibility of meeting with a Synod support staff member who will help you with this process. This, by the way, is not required. You can do this all by yourself without any input from us. Both of us have looked at quite a few constitutions, and sometimes we can find little things that might be helpful to you, but you don't have to use us at all. Anyway, you can start the process somewhere along the line and go, well, maybe it would be good to talk to them. Let us know that. So you can do that at any point. You review your constitution and the ELCA model constitution for congregations. And it's on the ELCA's website. We have the links for that. You make the proposed changes and you go about getting information on what you want to change there. And then it's into how these things have to be in writing. The changes have to be in writing. They have to be filed with your congregational council at least 60 days before the meeting that the congregation will meet to vote on it. And then the council will take a look at it, make changes, and maybe add, subtract to your recommendations. And then they send that on to the entire congregation, the members of the congregation. And that has to be done at least 30 days before the meeting. And those are written in stone. And then you hold a congregational meeting and vote, and afterwards forward a copy of the Constitution and the amendments to the Synod office. Sean?
That 30 days, is that specific to meetings where you're going to vote on changes to the Constitution? Because the old standard was 15 days by mail or two 2 Sundays before the meeting.
Yeah, I know, this is where,
No,
no, go ahead.
this is specific to constitutional changes.
Right.
What you're referencing often was related to special congregational meetings or annual meetings.
Right.
This, anytime you are doing a constitutional even amendment change or bylaw, there has to be this notification, and they have to see it. It's not that you just have to tell them, but you also have to present what that's going to be, have it available for folks.
Could be printed, it could be online, something like that. It needs to be written down so people can actually read that. Okey doke, we're going through the details next. And even before your team, and most of you presumably are on council, but or you wouldn't be here logically, maybe you have been or going to be. So there may have been some talk of what we need to change. For example, $1,000, we gotta do something about this to change that, make it more reasonable, either get that out or doing. So that's something you're thinking, maybe I wanna change. There may be a lot of other things. So that's at one end of things. At the other end of things, you really, as soon as churchwide updates the model constitution, you should change your constitution to conform to that. The review process there is actually a little bit streamlined, not much, but we'll talk about that later. But if that's what you're going to do, that's actually less work, and it's have to be less controversial. But there are certain steps you need to go through, and we'll talk about that too in a little bit. Then you come up with a team to work on it, and it's best to have a group of people. There need to be people who are detail oriented, and people who will focus on the process itself, and people who will do proofreading. You will end up doing things and you will be just overcome with your brilliance on how well you did it. And then you hand it to somebody, and she takes a look at it and she goes, did you really do that? And it was some wording problem and you had just messed up. So there are a lot of times you need to be looking. It takes time. First of all, you need to decide what exactly you're going to do. Get a team. And sometimes there are people who want to be on that team who, to use a phrase, have an agenda. They have something they want to change in the Constitution or whatever it is. Thinking of our former pastors, his father was a pastor in South Dakota. They were wanting to build an addition to the church, and it was going to have to go on the side of the church, and they had to decide whether it was the east side or the west side. And for some of us, we go, but they ended up and decided one, and some people left the church because they put it on the other side of the church, built on the other side. So as much as you can avoid this, and people who have an agenda, have something that they want to address, it's very, very important that you hear from them. Absolutely. Having them on the team, you need to be thinking about that because they may be spending their whole time just on their item, whatever it is that they want to talk about. And you really need people who will look at the whole thing. So be careful when you put your team together. Any history you have in what you've seen? Oh.
Yes. It is important, and to have people who are looking at the whole picture and have a desire to be updating for the purpose of the whole country.
Yes. Enough said, but that's beware. We talked about already the Constitution. That's intended to be the permanent part, sort of permanent. It's a living part that goes on, but it's harder to change. This is what you really want. And that's what you really want locked in. Bylaws kind of are under that. There is, in the model constitution, there are no bylaws. That's up to you. It comes through adding, we're having an annual meeting, says the Constitution. The bylaws may say, we have that in January or February, or something like that. So it's works out. Changes with the Constitution, we'll talk to you a little bit about that process. The bylaws also require, can be a special meeting, but they also have to have that 60-day, 30-day that we talked about. Continuing resolutions don't, but these do. You eventually need to combine, their recommendation is combining the Constitution, bylaws, continuing resolutions, all in one document that isn't Constitution, bylaws, continuing resolutions. It's wherever part of the Constitution a bylaw pertains to, it should be parked right underneath it. So it just reads straight through. So you don't, the whole idea is you're taking a look at everything at the same time. We'll talk about numbering systems. They have an interesting way of doing it.
It's in your example.
Yeah, right. It is in there on how to do that. And it's just saw one of the constitutions from Peace in Iota, which I really like the way they do that, is when it comes to they use the same numbering system, but if it's a bylaw, there's a B in front of it. And that gives you a hint. You're in a bylaw, you're not in the Constitution. See, and there's no objection to doing it. That's not part of what's recommended, but I thought that was just a really slick way of doing it. Very good. You need to have your original articles of incorporation for your church. Now, most of the time, you get that through the state of Minnesota, the Secretary of State. But when it starts out, the very first thing in your Constitution, it describes the name of your church. And it has to be exactly the same as the Secretary of State says it is. You have articles of incorporation. They may be in a safe place in your church office. They may be in a safe deposit box. Should you not be able to find that after a thorough look, you can get copies from the Secretary of State or from sometimes the incorporation is through your county, and they would have that as well too. For the Secretary of State, it's not hard to request it. I don't think it's hard for them to get it. It can be a while before it gets back to you. So in the process, be sure that is there before. Anytime you do your Constitution, take the time to be sure the name is the same.
So here's for an example. When I was in Southwestern Minnesota Synod congregation, their legal name was Emmanuel Lutheran Church of Fingston, which was the township. And they always went by just Fingston Church. Nobody called it anything else until I arrived and was calling it Emmanuel. And when we looked at the Constitution, guess what it said? Fingston. The Articles of Incorporation. So the Constitution is a legal document. So if you don't know where your Articles of Incorporation are, maybe you're not even going to do your Constitution, but go find those. Make sure somebody knows where they're at. A safety deposit box, a safe within the church, a file on the secretary's desk, but that is your legal name, your legal document for that, to put that into your Constitution. And it can be updated if you're no longer the Swedish American Lutheran Church of Chisago City, where I also served at one time, then, you want to make sure you're Chisago Lakes Lutheran Church of Center City, right?
Do you have to register that with the state?
Yeah, you have to do some name changing. But it's not that difficult to do, but it is an updating that if that's no longer the name, then you want to update legally. Yes.
From experience, I will tell you, if you don't have it, start now.
Yes.
It took me several months to find it in a county register's office, and they had gone through a document change system where they had copied all these, and when you got a document from the 1800s, they don't copy.
Right, yeah.
And you wind up with a lot of work.
Yeah.
So please don't wait till
Right.
a month or two before.
Thank you for that
Yeah.
illustration.
Yeah.
I think that's the worst one I've heard about how bad it was. And this was back in the 1800s. When it was
1800s,
incorporated.
and it was incorporated in a county,
Yeah,
and of course, the county burned down.
the county burned down.
Yeah.
County
County offices.
The courthouse burned,
Yeah.
and so you had to change.
Yeah.
If that is the case for some, especially our congregations in Minnesota, I will tell you that our archivist for our Region 3 is housed out of Luther Seminary. And he's incredible. And they have, throughout many years, have gathered documents from congregations throughout our whole region. So it may be that that is on microfiche there with our Region 3 archivist, which we are a part of, one of the synods of that. So if that's the case, it may be there as well. Doesn't necessarily have to be, but if your congregation's records, especially if you are an older congregation, they might be landed with the microfiche of the archivist.
Very good point. And you don't have to come up with the original. A copy will work. You just need to be sure that the name is the same. Back up, first of all, you're going to be looking for the model constitution. That's what, this is kind of what it looks like.
Those were the introductory pages that we gave you, that it really does have a lot of good information in there for you.
And then one of the things that you'll find, I think will be helpful, if I can figure out how to move this. There's a place where, we'll show you how to get to, where the amendments are. These are things how have changed between 2019 and 2022. They've highlighted them, underlined across that. Now, there are two in that slide I just was showing. One is the address at elca.org. If you are brilliant and really like being a sleuth, you too can use the ELCA's website to find things. You need to be really good. The Synod has provided you with something that is far faster of getting there. They actually take you to the ELCA, but they do it good. Oh, we're here.
Yep.
Slideshow, yes.
On the Synod's website here, SEMN if you just even go to the congregationals tab, in there you'll see a constitution, tab, and that list will be this PowerPoint as well. We hope to add that. There's another PowerPoint that helps you. It gives you a link right to the model constitution. It gives you some other resources. It's a helpful tool.
You click that and it'll take you to ELCA. And the first thing that appears there is a copy of the model constitution, August 2022, and the amendments. And you have to just click them. Do it this way. Okay. Create a timeline. Unless you're doing just an update, this will take you a lot longer than you think it's going to take. 6 months is not horribly unusual. Part of it is getting the people together and the times they have. And, this kind of gets low on people's list of priority and getting it done. There are little variations. You work for a while and then you find a few things that need to change, and you talk with the congregation and they have their ideas too. So to make a timeline, but then plan on taking a long time. You ask your committees for their input, how their committees are running, what they're doing practical. That will inform them of the timeline. They'll get back to you. There are two ways of approaching it. I will tell you how We have always done it. But there was a chap from St. Paul Synod, was that, when his suggestion was, what you do is you can start with the model constitution. That is your foundational one. And then bring your stuff into it. And he found that to be the best way of doing it. We have always done it the other way. We start with our, and did you do it that way?
I've always done it with, starting with the model constitution.
You did. And we always start with ours and then move the parts of the model into. And it doesn't matter in particular, you still have to pay attention to the details. But either way work, just make that decision on how you want to do it. Yes,
Maybe you're gonna cover this later, if so, that's fine. If you've got a constitution currently that does not particularly line up well with the model constitution, and you choose to start with the model and add in things, when you go about voting on that, do you vote piecemeal on all the different changes? Do you just vote to replace your current constitution with the new one you come up with?
You can do either or. You are allowed to do, you can present as an entire document for voting upon. That the entire thing, if it's so outdated, you're voting on an entire update of your constitution together. Bylaws, resolutions, the whole thing. You're allowed to do that as long as everyone knows that they have the opportunity, that if there's a provision that they want removed from that to be voted upon, they have that right as well,
Oh, to be voted upon separately.
separately. Mhm.
Yes, that would be the-
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I-
Therein line, that's by the way, probably the slickest way of accomplishing it. Now, depending on your congregation, there may, well, I would like to see what's being deleted and what's added. And if it's been more than 2 years, there may be a lot
Mhm.
of lines through and underlines, and they want to see everything that's there. You can accomplish what, as she was mentioning, by showing you the new one, showing them what they have now, so they have both copies.
In 2 congregations where I had very old constitutions, started with the model constitution and brought the old constitution and bylaws and continuing resolutions into that and showed everything in one document. All of the old stuff that was no longer pertinent, redlined out. Everything that was going to be new language in blue. Everything, I mean, all of those changes using a color code system. One of the things that is not here is not necessarily something you have to do, but that I have chosen to do is to have a couple of meetings, town hall meetings, where people can just ask questions about the Constitution, what's happening, can walk through it, so that when you get to that annual meeting or that special congregational meeting, you don't have this huge amount of time because of all the questions that people might have. So that gives people a time for conversation before you ever get to that voting day. And that can help with those kinds.
There are 2 things. One of which you can have some of these sort of meetings ahead of time before you even start out.
Mhm.
Is there anything going on that you would like to see changed in the Constitution? But she's talking about something, really having kind of town hall meetings, take the time to just simply go over it and spend the time. And hopefully not do it at the time you're doing your annual meeting.
Depends on how complicated your changes are.
Sounds like you may have a project. There are certain things we talk about, there are in the model constitution that are required. They have to go into your constitution as is. No changes can be made to them. There's a real good reason for doing it, because a lot of these things are handling the really difficult things that have been gone over by pastors, attorneys, HR people. And so legally, they're things that really make sense. Now and they have little asterisks attached to them. They are not debatable. They have to go there. Now, there are plenty of them that are not. They don't have the asterisks. And those you can include You don't have to have them in, you can make changes to them, whatever you want to with that. And those are, could be geared to whatever your situation is. There's a certain degree of feeling that the model constitution, and you have to do this as is really restrictive on you. And it's true, it is. But there's a really good reason for that. Any questions at this point? Okay. And you develop that system of marking the changes, red and blue, underline, cross out, things like that. That helps just unbelievable to be able to do that. Talk about bylaws and continuing resolutions, policies and procedures are none of these things. These are things that you can change. They shouldn't come anywhere near the Constitution. They could be stored on the shelf next to it, but not part of this. And this is things like who's making the coffee on Sunday, things like that.
Can I ask, do you know what the difference of a continuing resolution is? Or is that something to be defined? No, okay. So a continuing resolution within your constitution, the congregation votes upon, but that continuing resolution gives power to the council related to that item for decision making. And it does not need to come before the congregation for any kind of approval. So an example, a continuing resolution was added to one of a previous congregation's constitution that said, the congregation council shall have the power to add or change committee structure as per the needs of the ministry life of the church. So for instance, some congregations, you still have like 20 committees listed in their bylaws that you have to live by, but nobody's actually in any of those committees and they're not functioning. But because they're in bylaws, they're sitting there and nobody's voted any change on them. And then the council is like, hey, maybe we should combine these into one. Well, according to your bylaws, you can't do that. And council has no power to do that. You have to take all of that before your congregation and vote upon those changes. If you were to vote the power of a continuing resolution into the hands of your leaders, then you're placing them, the trust in them to do that on the congregation's behalf. And a bylaw is something that would need constitutional change, but it does not have to be sent in and approved by the synod and the council, and a bylaw is changed within your own system and then enacted. Mm-hmm.
If you're doing tiny pinpoint changes rather than what I was asking about before, are there different voting requirements for the Constitution, for bylaws, and for continuing resolution?
Yep, and that's in the model constitution, and that's for that's part of like Robert's Rules of Order piece, and that's in your model constitution and then brought in. So you can't you can't say, oh, I'd like 5 people to be able to vote on this to see if it gets approved, right? No, this is a 2/3 majority piece that has to be done. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Presently voting, right?
Yeah.
Okay, no. Now we're moving into ratification. We have done that. Remember the 60-day, 30-day we talked about. You managed to get this all done. You think it's beautiful and you sent it in. Congregation votes on it and they approve it. Now, a copy needs to be sent. And this to the Synod. Barb Street is the one to send it to. The council, the Synod council will review it, approve it, and then it becomes effective. Changes are effective when you receive that notice from the Synod, not before.
2 different things regarding this. One, I highly recommend you send your electronic changes or hard copy to the Synod Constitution person, which is Pastor Barb Street, before you ever get to that annual meeting. Allow them to have the possibility of looking at, have us look at it, so that there aren't any needs for change legally, things that are not in conformity. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you take it to your congregation, you vote on it, you send it in, and there's problems, now you gotta go back, right? So that's one thing. When it comes to ratification, if you look at your constitution, say you vote on the whole change update of your constitution at your annual meeting. Send that in. Synod sends you back that they've approved it. That's a 120-day process. Okay, you can schedule a special congregational meeting to ratify that constitution and have it all done. But you also, most congregations wait the entire year and ratify it at the next annual meeting. Okay, so Constitution does give you the ability to have a special meeting for ratification in a shorter time period than waiting the entire year for ratification. So, and ratification, a reminder that when you get to that point, nothing, absolutely zero, is up for debate and can be changed. A ratification vote is simply saying yes again, and then it's enacted, right? If you're only doing the required amendment changes for the model constitution, that does not need a ratification vote.
And we'll talk about that in just a second here too. So that's one of the things that's a little different. Yeah.
So you're saying you want bylaws and continuing resolutions within the document.
Mhm.
My understanding, bylaws and continuing resolutions don't need ratification.
That if it's in your whole document, if you're voting on a separate bylaw, no, you don't need to. If you're voting on a full constitutional update, any amendment
To the
to
Constitution.
the constitution
Just to the
needs a
constitution,
ratification.
not to the bylaws.
That's correct.
And a non-required amendment though, or provision, does not need ratification.
The whole idea of putting it together is that you may have Constitution here, bylaws here, and there's something in the bylaws that tell you what you should be doing, and you didn't realize it was there. And so it's trying to bring it in.
I have a question.
Mhm.
You're a pastor.
You're a pastor, but.
No, my, she's
Oh, I see.
her pastor.
Oh, I see.
No, so she'll take care of this.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Our constitution now is in book form. It's not typed, I mean, it's not on computer. Okay, you're talking about you highlight or obtain this red and this blue. Does that mean we will physically type all the old one up for people to see? I mean, or are we gonna, are you gonna just highlight that book?
A really great tool is to utilize Adobe Converter, which I have. That's word. But you can scan a document into Adobe Converter. It's in a PDF or a JPEG. You go to your converter and say, I want this in a Word doc, and it does it for you.
And there are people around that can do it. Yeah. And I imagine that they're either in your congregation or somebody around there that can help you with that. These are neat, and there are ways of even taking two documents and merging them together. Electronically, it's kind of cool. Here's chapter 16. This is one of the required chapters. Now, this has to do with the review process, and the little notes, it could be a bit confusing, might be an understatement. 01, 02, 03 refer to sections of the congregation that are required and may be amended by the way we described it.
They're not required.
They're not
Slide
required,
says
not required. Did I say required? I apologize. Not required, and they may be amended. And once they're amended, we talked about how the process goes to the council and then to the congregation. They vote for it, and then gets sent on to church council, Senate council. However, if all you are doing, you had updated your constitution, I say in 2019, and now the 2022 has come through, all you are doing is making the changes in the required part of the Constitution that changed with the new model Constitution in August of 2022. All you're doing to it, nothing new, no amount of dollars that can be spent here, thither, or none, nothing like that. Then what happens is that you can do that, put them into the Constitution, and then it just automatically gets taken care of. You still need to let the Senate know that you've done that. But it's actually fairly straightforward process, if that's all you're doing.
So within chapter 16.01, for instance, the provision itself is required. But within many provisions within the model constitution, you are going to see blanks. And that means that you get to choose as a congregation what you're going to put into that. So for instance, in number 1601, provision says, amendments may be proposed by at least blank voting members or by the congregation council. So for instance, if you want to say 10 people will have the right to propose an amendment change to the congregation council, you can say 10. If you want 50, if you want it, there's a specific number that you put in. So the provision itself is required, but you have choices within that. Does that make sense? So some of those pieces are within.
That's still in conformity.
Yep. Mhm.
And you have to fill in all the blanks.
Mhm. There are lots of different blanks to fill in. Yes, in the model constitution.
They're not hard to fill in.
No.
I mean, these are just intuitive sort of things.
Yep.
Whatever
Number
your
of voting members that
Right.
make a quorum.
Right.
Could it be percentage or a number? You know, some congregations are still living under the, past and saying 75 people for a quorum, and they barely have 60 people worshiping, right? So that needs a change.
Last but not least is the number system. Read it. It describes it there.
Yes. Yep, and it's actually not that bad. I mean, I know that I've done this a number of times, so it's a little easier for me. But if you go to the codification examples, right? The back of that. So it tells you how you can code, your provisions. They're going to be C for chapter, right? C chapter 5. 02 is the provision. Maybe there's 01, there's 02, those are 03, right? Then if you have a bylaw that relates to that, you're going to go down to B there for bylaws. You're still going to be within the chapter, that's C5. You're going to be within the provision, that's 03, right? Now, 0.01, now you're entering into the bylaw number.
Don't forget the point. That's what separates it.
Yeah. Right? Now, maybe you're under that same provision. You want to give the council power over something. You're going to add a continuing resolution. So you're still in chapter 5. 0.03 is the provision. Now it's point A. Notice there's a letter now. That means continuing resolution. And you give it the year number. Okay, does that make sense?
It would be 23. So
Yeah.
A23, the next one will be B23.
So it gives a letter and a year that it relates to.
I see the warmth of your smile.
Sounds to me like you're better off to call that Barb Street, and let her.
Yeah, let it committee.
Yeah. Barb is wonderful, by the way.
Yeah, well, and Noel and I are both available to help with those kinds of things as
Sure.
well. That's why it's really important to, although you can do this all on your own, you don't have to connect with us whatsoever. But that's why it's important to maybe you either at least have someone look at it before you're going to vote in conversation, or to look at it ahead of time and say, this is a bylaw, you don't have this numbered correctly, right? That one, or this looks like, are you doing a resolution here, a continuing resolution? So,
Barb Street is the point of contact.
Yeah.
We both do it and we share the workload. The trick is that she may have 300 that she's been working on and I have 2. And so it's my, no, that's not gonna happen.
Yeah.
But what happens is that sometimes there will be, one of them be taking a lot longer to work on. So Barb is the one who can manage that a little bit.
she's the contact.
You were talking before that you draw up changes or whatever you want in the Constitution, and then you vote on it at your annual meeting, and then it gets sent back to the Synod. That
Correct.
they okay it. Can you not draw it up, send it to the Synod for their okay before you vote on it at your congregational meeting?
That's kind of what she was talking about. The answer to that is yes, you can send it and it'll come to one of us to read it. But you can do exactly that.
Before the original vote?
That is correct.
Okay.
We're happy to do that.
Because then you can go into it knowing what your corrections were supposed to be, because you'll get a response back about what that is, or, hey, looks fabulous, great job, move forward, right?
So that way the congregation only votes on it once.
No, they'll still have to ratify if it's amendment changes. That's a constitutional thing. The approval by the Synod does not supersede constitutional work.
No. I agree. I understand that. But I
Yeah.
mean, if it's approved by the Synod committee or whatever, before the congregation votes on it the first time,
Mhm.
then there should only need to be one. Oh, because
Then
then it's just a ratification vote.
yep, you vote on it and then you follow up with a ratification if it's amendment changes.
Same
Yeah.
day.
No, a ratification has to be separated by time. Yep, and constitutionally, I think that's 120 days.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah, yep. But you could call a special congregational meeting if you want to have it sooner than waiting the annual meeting. But that's constitutional. Yep. There has to be time for ratification.
I was trying to think how we did the last one. I only remember voting once.
Except for if it's a bylaw change. You don't have to have ratification, you don't have to have a second vote, or if it's a required provision from the ELCA that you're simply voting to approve, those go into effect immediately. So it has to do with provision versus bylaw versus continuing resolution, and provision, whether it's required or non-required.
You lost me.
I'm sorry, it's amendment. Amendment. They call them provisions now, so, yeah, sorry. Yeah,
I got 2 questions possibly. If all we're doing is just making sure our constitution lines up with 2022, we still have to vote.
yes,
Okay, I misunderstood that.
Yeah, that is correct.
yes.
Okay,
You
so we
cannot,
make the changes and then we get it out there, the timeline, but all we're really doing is making sure that we're in agreement.
yep.
Okay.
If the only provisions that you're updating are those to become compliant with the 2022
Uh-huh.
model constitution,
We still.
that's a
vote.
one-time congregational vote,
Okay.
and then you're updated.
Okay.
You can't just say, oh, we're part of the ELCA, and even though our constitution was back in 1999, we want to follow what 2022 says.
Right.
Doesn't work
Okay, I
that
think
way.
you just, okay, so my, a follow-up to that was what if it doesn't they vote no, that's a bigger issue.
Yes,
Okay, okay, maybe this is a dumb question that I'll realize as
No
I'm saying
dumb
out loud. But we've just recently found bylaws
Mhm.
that we don't know who put them together,
sure.
haven't been voted on.
Mm.
What is our responsibility?
First responsibility is to make sure they haven't been voted on.
We know they haven't,
You have no records from the
but
past.
people still are remembering them, but we can't actually figure out their origin.
Well, that in itself, if you really have searched all your past documents and
Uh-huh.
all your past constitutions, and there's no language that is related to those bylaws,
Mhm.
then they're probably policies that people were, following.
Okay.
The danger is that if people are believing they are bylaws, you have to be able to show that there's no voted upon time where they were a bylaw.
And I think we're all agreed that they're not,
Okay.
have not been voted on. Would you recommend, let's say if they were done in the last 5 to 10 years, would you recommend that we shouldn't just discard them, we should look over them, see if they're valid or
I
whatever?
would see if there's any useful
Okay.
pieces from them,
Okay.
see if they're policy versus bylaws.
Uh-huh.
Any of them should be continuing resolutions,
Okay.
and then treat them as such for your constitution update.
Okay.
And the bylaws, policies, of course, don't
Yeah.
have to be voted on.
No,
The
Maybe some of those-
policies don't, right,
And some of them, turns out some of the things that people have made into bylaws are really policies.
yeah.
right, and that's, I've looked at them a
Yep.
little, that's kind of what they more feel like, but, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But if there's a bylaw in there, or in this document, wherever you have that, or whatever you found, that talks about like an annual meeting, number of people, that's a bylaw issue.
Right, okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Even if we're changing bylaws, we should send it into the Synod.
They need to see it at some point, yeah, that's
Yeah.
correct. That's correct.
It doesn't like go to the full city council for approval and get a letter back, but it's good to make sure that it's in compliance with the model constitution provisions, so that you're not out of compliance, or it's not in conflict with one of the.
I have just a question about, so during COVID, was there any provisions made to have electronic voting of the membership?
Yes,
Rather
Yes,
than
and
in
that's in the
person?
Constitution.
It is in the
Yeah.
Constitution.
Yes.
Thank you.
yes, yep. And if you are living under one that you voted upon at that time, the Synod provided one, an example of one that congregations could adapt at that time. You certainly can use that language, or use the model constitution language, or create your own related to that electronic provision. Because some people want it to say different things. For instance, how many, how we do that, is it via Zoom, email, phone, so you can define that.
Great cut.
Thank you so much
Thank you very
for
much.
your willingness to be
Good.
here. We appreciate it.